Ladies and gentlemen, you have a real treat coming up because the absolutely amazing Andy Kaufman, Francie Rawlings, Laszlo Gong, Maria Matarelli, Jennifer Tharp.
You have to be able to see the big picture. You have to have kind of a systems mindset.
We often don't think of those people. Like, who are those people that are going to impact us?
You have to do something different than the average person if you want to be a leader, right?
Folks, I cannot tell you how pleased I am that Aliza Knox is going to be joining us. She is heavily in demand right now, and that is all to the good. But I'm a little bit upset, and I'll tell you why. I could have really used this book. Aliza, and together with her partner, wrote a book called Don't Quit Your Day Job. And I'd love to say that the book was actually the reason that I wanted to interview her for this, but the book was a bonus. And since I like to at least try and do a little bit of homework, I dove right into it the minute it got released. As a matter of fact, we were talking back and forth about doing this interview as you were tightening up and finishing up the last moments of this writing. And I really appreciate your still being patient with me. And I got about, I don't know, 15 pages in and thought, I could have really used this. I could have really used this. So I'm very jealous of your audiences, Aliza. And thank you so much for joining us here.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
So a couple of things that I'm kind of curious about. When you talk about the mind shifts, the power shifts that have to happen in people's heads, one of the most interesting things that you said was that looking at your career as a relationship could help you actually craft how you're going to stay healthy, how you're going to keep your relationship with your career healthy. Could you kind of expand on that for me?
Sure. I wrote the book, Don't Quit Your Day Job, because I've been working for over 40 years, and I have a lot of people who come to me for advice, coffee mentoring, I guess I'd call it. And I found that I was saying some things over and over. And one of the things I know from tech is that you have to be scalable. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll write all this down. And I guess one of the mind shifts that I came to realize later, I probably could have used the book sooner too, except for I didn't know how to write it. One of the things I came to realize later is that your career is sort of like a partner, like a relationship you're in. And for anybody who's been in a relationship with another human being or is still in one or has been in more than one, I think if we read about this or listen to programs, one of the most common things I hear said, or we hear said, is don't expect everything from your partner. Don't expect everything from that one other person. It will damage the relationship. They cannot fulfill everything you need. And that makes sense to me. But somehow we put that all on our career. I think at some point in the Industrial Revolution, people moved from farming to working where they got a paycheck so that they could put food on the table. And then obviously life got better and better, and we wanted more out of our jobs. And I think there were very reasonable expectations that a job could be, in many cases, rewarding, fulfilling. You could learn from it. But then we've sort of escalated to a point where I think there's a lot of requests that a job be fulfill all your passions, fulfill all your expectations and in life, and meet all your needs. And I think that might be unrealistic. I think it's a very, very high bar. I think that for some people, that might be possible. You might have a job that is just everything, particularly if an entrepreneur starts a company, maybe that's everything they need right at the moment because they're so intimately involved with it. But I think for a lot of people, the job can't meet all your needs, and asking it to do so is kind of too much. And so thinking about ways that you can almost partner with your careers is what I was talking about. So in the book, there are these 6 mind shifts, and for each mind shift, are 4 power perspectives. And then for each power perspective, there are some action steps. So I won't go into all of them here, but one of the ones about partnering with your career is thinking about, is the career everything I want? And there are some examples that work for more than one mind shift, but for example, there is a woman discussed who is a professor named Marla Stone. Sometimes people's names are disguised, sometimes they're not. She was in Rome. This is a real person. She was in Rome for a professorship that was highly sought after. She loved it. And she wanted to go to the next level, which was to sort of run this aspect of the school and the, I think it's a foundation. And she applied and was rejected. She didn't have a lot of, even though she was a super successful academic, she didn't have some of the qualifications that they wanted for this larger role, I think directing basically the Institute. And so she went back to Southern California where she lives, and she thought about, well, what else, do I want to do? There are things that I really want to do that are part of my life, but are not part of my career. But that's okay. I need to do these things that I need outside. And she joined the ACLU as a board member for Southern California, and eventually became the chair of the American Civil Liberties Union. I think most people in the US know this, became the chair of that organization. And subsequently, the position in Rome came up again, and she thought, I'm going to try one more time. I'll just apply one more time. And she got it this time. And she got it because in terms of taking care of her relationships and things that she needed in her life besides the job, she had taken on the work at the ACLU. A lot of the work that she did as chairperson, organizing, understanding how to fundraise, understanding the financial position of the NGO, gave her the skills that she needed for this job in Rome. So she's happily ensconced in Rome at the moment with the position that she's always wanted. So she had not expected everything from her career. When she couldn't get everything she wanted from it, she sought some outside outlets that were good for her. And in the end, that nurtured her career and brought her back. So that's one aspect of being in a relationship with your career. I think another one is setting boundaries. We all talk about setting boundaries in our relationships. And I think in your career, you need to do that too. And it's particularly pertinent now that we're, often working from home. So, maybe it used to be that people wouldn't bother you when you're at home because you're, they'd say, oh, she's at home, she's with her kids, or she's with her husband or her partner, or she's doing something she really cares about. But now it's like, well, she's at home because we all work from home. And so maybe times don't matter, or times of day or time zones don't matter as much. And so I think people need to work harder to set boundaries. Like, this is my hour, this is one that's really pertinent for me. I need an hour to go to the gym. So that's really an hour and a half, sometime during the day, 15 minutes to get there, an hour to work out, 15 minutes to get back. I've always had it in my schedule. Could be in the morning, could be at night, could be in the middle of the day if I've got really early morning calls with the US because I'm in Singapore, or really late night calls with Europe. And it's really important for me to protect some time for myself, to have that time to release energy, because I have probably, in my case, too much of it. And then what's great as a leader is it's in my Google Calendar, everybody can see it, and they know that it's okay, that it's permissible to have that time to set that boundary. And another one you probably need to set it around is sleep. We all have probably been exposed to the Arianna Huffington articles about how she rediscovered how important sleep is. I just read another article today, a new one, about how they think sleep or lack of it or interrupted sleep causes heart problems. There's definitely been some evidence that it might be a contributing factor to dementia, which is something I have to start worrying about now. So those are other boundaries you can set to really nurture this relationship with your career and your time at work. Sorry, I've gone on. It's something I'm passionate about.
This is important stuff, because one of the things that really struck me, particularly because there are all sorts of boundaries, was the sense of many people in leadership have a mindset of to a great extent, of servant leadership. I'm going to use my power, my juice, if you will, my influence to make sure that my team has what they need in order to succeed. And I'm going to serve the organization by deploying these skills as best I can. But the comment that I found interesting, particularly since we both are women in technology and talk to a lot of other women in technology, was the point that you can be of service. You need to draw a line and a boundary about not being seen to be subservient.
Yeah, well, so that's interesting. I think that is something that happens to a few people, and more often women, not only, where in their efforts to really help everybody out, they maybe go too far beyond the extra mile. So I gave an example in the book of a young woman that I know who moved to a new office for her company. And so they were just setting up, and there was no, it was a small outpost. So there was no office manager or no facilities person. And so she was doing things like she thought she'd help out. And she was also the only woman in the office for a little while. Her brother came to visit. They went to IKEA, bought shelves for the office and set them up. And she was always the one who would volunteer to take notes, or the one who would go and get coffee. And it's really a nice thing to be able to offer. And she thought she was being friendly. And of course, people complimented her for it. And I think it's great to do it once in a while, but I think she also started carving out a role for herself where people expected that. And she was becoming almost subservient, even though she was certainly mid-level in the office, definitely not the most junior person, not the most senior yet, but she's on a great career trajectory. And so she was kind of carving out this space for herself as if she was meant to be the office manager and meant to be doing these things. And people, although they thanked her, which was great, it's not like it was thankless, but were expecting it of her. And she had a full-time real job at the company in sales, not in getting coffee and tea and setting up bookshelves. And so I think, I observed this and sort of said to her, you might want to step back from that a bit and give other people turns, like maybe do a rotation for buying office snacks so that it's not expected of you. She was surprised, but she's actually changed a little bit.
I think it is partly also for those people who have a leadership style that is of service, is they also have a tendency to nurture along very pragmatic lines, like, feeding people. But it's not something that, to the point that you made in the book, it's not something that I see a lot of guys doing. And if somebody doesn't step up and just kind of gently tap us on the shoulder and say, you might want to back off on that a little bit, because there are all sorts of places where boundaries are important. And it's not that we don't want to help people be comfy. We just don't need to help them build a habit of expectations. And that is so very easy to do, because we're always training people just by how we act in their presence and how we allow them to act in our presence. We train them to believe what is perfectly acceptable, and we don't always remember that sometimes. So
Right, I agree. And it's good to be able to, obviously each of us is able to see somebody else from the outside and give some feedback. And I think if you give it pretty quickly, it has more impact. And it's important because everybody's watching her or me. And as more junior women came into the office, they see her and she's a great role model. So then, maybe they start adopting those habits when they don't need to. So it's much better, I think, if we can give people feedback, tap them on the shoulder, as you say. It doesn't mean they have to stop doing everything immediately, but just to set some boundaries and learn to, not set expectations beyond what their real role is in the firm. And actually, it's kind of interesting, just because your audience is in leadership and looking at this, there's tool, a piece of software in beta called OnLoop. And I know there's some other tools. OnLoop is mobile first, which makes it really easy to carry around and use. But to give that kind of, note that kind of feedback right away, and then use it later, it actually uses AI to do performance evaluations. And so I think thinking about having a way to capture that feedback, I mean, you're probably not going to say it to her in a meeting, oh, Kimi, you shouldn't have brought the coffee. Now we all expect you to bring coffee every time. Like, you don't want to give it that immediately. But if you don't remember right after the meeting, you might want to record it, because if you wait till your annual performance review, she'll have been doing it for a year.
That is, it's also, we have a much shorter conscious attention span sometimes than we like to think, particularly as we have all these different inputs. And so with the best of intentions, if we are able to give that kind of feedback in a timely fashion, number one, it's typically going to be more effective. Number two, they're going to be able to connect it at a visceral level, not just the head level, but the heart level. They're going to be able to connect it directly with the behavior that they just exhibited and that you just, saw. So it does have an immediacy that helps a great deal.
Exactly.
So I have to admit, because when I was reading the book, I have a weekly staff meeting, and after I read that particular one, I sat down with everybody and said, all right, look, we're doing a product launch, and this is very scary. It's the first one we've done. And I know everybody's trying to get everything just beautifully done. And I appreciate that. I do. I said, however, I'm getting emails from you folks at like 3 o'clock in the morning, my time, which means it's 2 o'clock in the morning, your time, and 5 o'clock in the morning, your time. And that's not good. I said, so let's draw some lines here about times when we're not available unless it's a showstopper, unless it's Katie bar the door and oh my God, I can't believe this is going on. But otherwise, let's just have some reasonableness, because I don't want you burning out. I don't want me burning out. And I don't want us to forget why we're doing this, because it's cool and it's fun and we think it's going to accomplish something important. Because we are starting to get, especially for people like you, when you're talking about a 24-hour day. I mean, when you're international and remote from a headquarters location internationally, there is just no way that you are doing a 9-hour day or just a 10-hour day. You have a 24-hour day if you're not careful.
Right. Well, you sound like a great boss. I'm sure your team appreciates it. Yeah, it's kind of funny on the remote part. When the pandemic hit and everybody said, oh my gosh, this has never happened before. I mean, the pandemic, obviously in our lifetimes, and it really, except for those who were around in 1918, nothing, and SARS in Asia, it hasn't quite happened before. But this idea that no one's worked remotely before, I was like, well, I kind of bristled at that. I was like, well, actually, if you are setting up France for Samsung, or you're setting up the US for Atlassian, or you're setting up, Asia for Splunk, you probably are having a similar experience. And so I have tried to write a few articles and think a lot about what I call taking the R out of remote, which makes it emote, because you do have to learn this thing about how do you manage teams that are in other places. I think respecting their time zone is part of it. I think including them is part of it. When you give examples for your firm, make sure you're not just giving MasterCard and Gap, give China Union Pay and Uniqlo, for example, if you're in Asia. Make sure when you're calling out employees who've done a great job, that you're not just calling out Susie and John, but you're also calling out Shochi and Komatsu, just really think about dispersed employees. And I don't love that word remote because I feel like, well, I'm sitting in Asia. Actually, the world's population is kind of centered here. Maybe my headquarters is remote. So I kind of like dispersed. I like dispersed better because what are we remote from? But anyway, I get that, I think the term is in common parlance, so I get it. But I try to use dispersed more or far flung because there's so many people in different places. And now that we are adjusting to a world with much more flexibility, which is great in so many ways, we've got to work harder at all that.
And it's going to be much more common that you're going to be working fairly intimately with people that you might not meet for months, possibly ever, in person. And yet there is a need for an emotional connection. And I love the way you put it, you said, make it human. And so how are some ways that we can do this? Because from my personal experience, I have been working in what we called at the time a virtual office environment since 1983.
So you're a pioneer. You should be writing about this instead of me.
Oh no, I'm not a pioneer. I'm tired. But at the time, I think we were making huge efforts to keep in contact with people because we were scared to death they'd forget about us.
Right.
We didn't see them in the hallway anymore. We never ran into them at the local sandwich shop anymore. And I think we got into those habits quite accidentally. So what are some of the specific things that you have found really help to establish that emotional connection as people, as opposed to just, this is your title, this is my title, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's harder to do without seeing people in person. I feel like a dinosaur sort of saying that. I still believe that it's great to meet people in person if you can. And even in, work from home scenarios, I was encouraging people, look, if you're in the same city, maybe once in a while, go for coffee or go for a drink or do a walking meeting, even if you don't have to. I think all the research shows that emotional connection to your firm increases retention. And I think Gallup has this study or poll that says that employees who are engaged, which means emotionally connected, and that means to each other as well as to the firm. Firms with engaged employees have 20% higher profit. That doesn't mean that if you get your employees more engaged right now, your profits will go up right now, right? So I have to be careful with that statistic, but generally they do better. So I did talk about making room for the human factor. And I think, one of the things is to treat all employees equal. I have found in years of working for global firms that at least before the pandemic, there was often kind of one set of rules for the employees at headquarters because most of the leaders were there and they made sure the healthcare was really good, the snacks were really good, everything was 9 to 6 their time, if you will. And then didn't really think about that for employees in other places. I mean, not that these leaders were rude or intentionally mean, but for example, I worked in a lot of cases with American companies where some consultant would say, oh, here's the average healthcare plan in Singapore, for example. And yes, it was maybe average if you took into account every level of company. But if you said, okay, you're at a Silicon Valley firm, so I need to compare you to other Silicon Valley firms, it wasn't average at all. And there was a lot of debate to remind people, listen, if we don't, for example, have maternity leave benefits in Singapore or in another country that equal the US, we're not going to get the same kind of employees. That's just a very small example. So I think really just making sure that all employees are treated equally. And I don't think anybody does that intentionally. They don't say, oh, I want to be rude to the employees in Slovakia. It just, they don't put as much effort into it and they don't see it as much because they're not there. Then I think a second thing is really making more time for recognition than seems necessary. I think firms are getting better and better at this. And, you know, if you read, although during this great resignation or great reshuffle or great reset, whatever it is, it's different by country and maybe different in different sectors. Yes, people are leaving as inflation hits and they want higher wages. And also, I think some people are leaving when one firm will offer them more flexibility and the other will give them none. But a lot of it is still around, my company cares about me, my manager values me, or respect, something in that vein. And one of the ways, obviously pay, bonus, performance reviews help reflect that. But there are lots of little things you can do, and acknowledging employees' achievements matters. And that can be, you know, we just talked about immediate feedback. It can also be immediate feedback for things that are going great. You know, you've done a terrific job selling that client, or we had a difficult client and you really helped them, you know, helped us keep them, and I really appreciate it. And so when we meet in the office, that stuff's easier. You pass me in the mini kitchen or you see me in the sandwich shop, as you say, and hey, you know, Aliza, that was a great job, and it's spontaneous and you get a lot of that. But I think serendipity is lacking when we're not in the same place. You know, that casual chit chat doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And so I think to the extent, you know, you mentioned weekly meetings in a smaller firm. Often these big firms have town halls where you call out, and I already mentioned that, names, and making sure you do that really is important. Some firms like Google, at least when I was there, had employee, I was just trying to think what it's called. They were called, oh, peer bonuses. You had access to a peer bonus. It was a small amount of money, but I could give it to somebody and they knew that I valued them. I know at MediaCorp, a big Singapore company, here they have a Kudos Hall of Fame. And so those things are able to kind of, you know, and you go up on it, just like I'm sure we've all seen in a lot of service industries, like hotels, you know, you'll see employee of the month, right? Or cleaner of the month. And those things really make people feel good, and they don't cost money. And they really help. And then another one is really sharing information at these town halls or in the intranet, or you know, having each office lead make sure that there's a weekly meeting so that people feel included.
I think that there is a sense sometimes that town halls are supposed to be a one-to-many, and that can make people feel very much like it is a one-to-many and they're being talked at as opposed to talked with. And as a professional speaker, you've probably already seen the difference between some of our colleagues will talk at their audience, bless their hearts, but there's a whole different level of engagement with our audiences that I can't believe isn't mirrored when you're working with your employees, when a town hall or even just giving everybody the update on the financials is more of a conversation.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I mean, I do find it hard to make it a conversation when you're trying to get, as you get bigger and bigger as a company, get the word out to everybody. I think techniques that I've seen that are good are, one, getting lots of different people to participate or present. So if the town hall is an hour, you know, in a large global company, then maybe, you know, 10 different people present, that's 6 minutes each, or even 20, 3 minutes each with a practice presentation about different things. I mean, I think you want it scripted in that we're talking about different strategic issues. You don't want just three, you know, you don't want 20 people to just get up and talk. I think maybe holding it at different times so that sometimes it's live for, say, Europe, and sometimes it's live for the US, and sometimes it's live in Latin America. I think sometimes having it's like an after party, you know, when you have a prom or a convention, they have an after party where each office maybe sits around and discusses over donuts or over beer, depending on what time of day it is. So I think there are ways you can take that big one-to-many meeting and make it more personal. But I do think, I have to say that I have sympathy for large companies as they get really big on how do you make that conversational.
I imagine. Now you've gone from fairly large firms in the financial arena to not exactly tiny firms.
No, never been at a really tiny,
Google,
well, once at a tiny
Twitter,
firm.
stuff like that. Firms in the tech area, and now as an advisor, senior advisor, and as someone who works with boards, you even are involved in the healthcare industry. So how was it that you were able to do that, to make those kinds of changes, still be true to your kind of leadership? I mean, if you were to go back, say, I don't know, 10 years, maybe 15 years,
Keep going.
what would you do? What would you tell you 20 years ago when, you know, you and I first started out, people took a job and the job and career were almost synonymous. There was really not a lot of thought of making changes. I mean, my sister-in-law was appalled when I left AT&T. And I said, but what do I want to do? We don't do anymore at AT&T. So I'm going to go do something that matters to me, that I think I can make a difference with. And she looked at me, she said, you're leaving because you don't like your job. I said, mm-hmm. Kimi, I hated my job for 35 years. What's loving your job got to do with it? And I remember thinking, okay. I don't have enough time in my lifetime to explain this to somebody. It's out of their context. But I mean, I look at those kinds of things and I wonder, what would you tell Lisa? Like,
Right.
back?
Well, I think there's two things I would tell myself. Don't be so afraid to let curiosity drive you. And, you know, by the way, the title of the book, which is, of course, Don't Quit Your Day Job, doesn't mean never quit your day job. It was just far more, it's a more interesting and punchy title than the 6 mind shifts to rise and thrive. And it's there because I think sometimes you shouldn't quit. Sometimes what's going on, like with Marla, you know, the woman, a professor I gave the example of,
Right.
even though she didn't get the job she wanted and she was unhappy or a little bit bored in her role, her, you know, purely academic role in Los Angeles, the right thing for her to do wasn't to quit. It was to do this outside thing that fulfilled some of her other needs. So that's why I mean, you know, don't always quit. You need to think about it. There are lots of things you can do. And I talk about in one of the chapters to broaden yourself or maybe make your life or job more interesting before you say, I have to quit. And a lot of times people like the company, maybe they just don't like the manager, or they like the manager and the company, but they don't like the role. And so those are cases where you don't quit. I don't mean never quit. And I've obviously quit a few times. I've had a number of jobs. And I think one of the things that I wish, so one of the things that I did do that I'm pretty happy about, although maybe not quite often enough, was be led by curiosity. You know, I left financial services, I left consulting because people said, well, you know, you're never going to get operating experience, you're never going to get P&L experience in consulting. So if you want to do that, you're going to have to go to, you know, a corporation. And that was why I left. I loved BCG, and that's why I've gone back as a senior advisor, because I think it's a great firm. And so that was my first curiosity step. And then when I was in the Bay Area in the early 2000s and we'd gone through the first .com boom and bust, you know, I just kept thinking, this internet thing is going on around me and I don't really understand it. And I'd love to know, and I'm not learning it. And when I met Vint Cerf, just quite serendipitously, who is one of the real founders of the internet, at something with Visa, I thought about it because I'd really met him for business. And I thought, is this too audacious? But I basically approached him outside on my personal email and said, hey, we met a couple of weeks ago. I'm really fascinated by Google and Yahoo and all these companies out there. And I think I'm older than the average person you're hiring, and I don't have a background in online media, but do you think anybody would ever talk to me? What could I do? And that started my conversation that led to me going to Google. And then after Google and Twitter, Cloudflare had, and I went to a little startup, a tiny startup, and then Cloudflare reached out and said, you know, might you be interested in talking to us? And I thought, wow, I don't really know anything about internet performance and security. So if I go there, I could, you know, leverage some of the things I do know about getting a company going in Asia for the US, but learn about a new product. And so, you know, Aliza 1.0 was consulting and financial services, 2.0 was tech, and now 3.0, now I talk in software releases because that's what I've been doing, is, you know, this other curiosity where it's like, what would it be like if I had more flexibility? I think COVID, you know, missing some parts of what I really like, which is travel and seeing clients and seeing teams, not being able to see my kids because some of the COVID restrictions, I mean, they're older. It's not like I'm not seeing a toddler, but really made me think, well, what would it be like to have this other career that's only boards and writing and speaking? And so I'm trying that. So curiosity led all those. And I think I see, you know, younger people now having even more curiosity, less stigma to changing jobs more often. And so I really like that. I would say to my younger self, maybe do more. The thing I really didn't do that I talk about in the book that I would really encourage people to do is get this kind of personal board of directors. Talk to more than one person as a mentor, more than your parents. I mean, some people don't talk to their parents at all. Some people use them a lot. You know, I love my parents, but they didn't work in the kind of career I had. So they were great for moral support, but not so much for business decisions. So go beyond that, go beyond a couple of friends who you whinge to at work. That's complain if you haven't lived in Australia or the UK.
I was gonna say, for those folks who don't
Yeah,
speak
American
Aussie.
whinge, complain, whatever, commiserate with.
I love that word though.
It's good. I think it's like onomatopoeic, whatever it sounds like what it is, but you know, whinge sounds complainy. But you know, find some people, like if you want to be in the medical profession, you know, find a nurse, find a doctor, find a physio, find a hospital administrator to talk to about what it's like and how they got into it before you just go start taking classes, things like that. That sounds obvious, but I've written a lot about, you know, how to form a personal board of directors, how to think about it, how to approach people, which doesn't include saying, would you be on my board of directors? I think nobody knows what that is, but kind of using the parallel that you see in corporates where they have a diverse group of people who kind of guide the company, although their primary job is to hire and fire the CEO, but then they do end up providing guidance, to think about that in a sort of a model for yourself.
I think that when I was reading about your comments about having a personal board of directors, I thought, I wonder if it's too late because I'm kind of winding things down now. And then I thought about it and I realized I have a personal board of directors. I just never really, I mean, we don't have, you know, annual or quarterly meetings, but they actually all know each other. And then I realized, but they don't know that they're actually my personal board of directors because they don't realize that one of the things they have in common besides knowing me is that I trust them for counsel. And I kind of jokingly call it my board of wisdom.
I think that's great that you've done that.
Mostly because I think there's the one thing that I wish I had told my younger self was.
What is that? What is that?
It's okay that you're not the smartest person in the room. Honestly, nobody expects you to be. Because I always thought I was supposed to be. Because I was the youngest and felt like I had a lot to prove. So I would wander around asking anybody who would help me what they thought, you know, what would they advise? And I would always tell people, that was the one thing my grandfather gave me was, I'm asking you for advice. Might not take it, but that doesn't mean I don't value it, and it doesn't mean I don't respect it. But I want to get a big, fuller picture of it. So I was reading your comments, and I thought, oh, I did that. Not as much of a failure as I thought, but it was kind of nice to see that that wasn't an accident, and the way that you were talking about it made it sound so eminently sensible and also very wise, because no single person is going to know everything about the context. Just like you said about your parents, they wouldn't necessarily understand the context, but you knew they had your back.
Well, I think it sounds like you inherently knew to do this. And I find it really impressive because I think that a lot of younger people who do feel they're supposed to be the smartest person in the room shy away from asking because they feel they need to prove themselves by not asking, and being bold enough to ask. I think that's courageous. And one of the things I worry about in work from home is that, or work remotely, is that some of the ability to ask people for advice or some of the chances to do it disappear, because a lot of, I've seen in professions that I would consider more apprenticeship-y, like consulting, legal, accounting, firms where you develop into a partnership, that young people are often, they want to ask for advice, but they don't want to make a big deal out of it. So they might just see you in the hallway and go, Kimi, you know, can you just look at this? Did I frame this question correctly? But asking to set up a Zoom meeting with a partner who's working from home is a bit scary. So then they don't do that at all. But I think the way you went around the board of directors sounds fantastic. I don't think you need to tell people they're on your board of directors. It sounds weird. I don't think people use that language yet. I sort of advise against it. I mean, I guess you could. I like board of wisdom. That sounds good. But yeah, I don't think I really thought about it that way or started doing it till I wanted to get on boards about 10 years ago. And then I started asking people, well, how do I do this? What do I do? How does it work? And then I realized, oh, this is what I'm doing. I'm asking different people with different perspectives how to go about this. But before that, I probably stuck to, you know, do I have one mentor or one person I ask for advice because I don't want to bother people and I don't want to admit that I don't know enough by myself. So I think you're way ahead of me.
Well, I don't know if I was way ahead of you. I think it's very easy to be clear that you're not going to be the smartest person in the room the minute you realize that you were never the smartest person in the room. So, but I also have the advantage of having a very dear friend of mine. As a matter of fact, the reason I was in Thailand quite recently, and he said he was significantly older than I am. Well, he still is, for that matter.
That's funny how that happens.
I know.
I'm waiting for my
I
younger
haven't
friends to
changed.
catch up with me so we can be the same age, but it's not happening.
Well, I'm hoping for the same thing. The difference is that Ted stays young at heart, and I sometimes get to be much more of a stodgy old fuddy-duddy. But at one point I said, oh, I can't ask so-and-so for that. He said, because he said, you know, just call them up and ask them for about a half an hour of their time. I said, I can't do that. He said, why not? They're busy. They don't know me. And there's really no good reason for them to do me this favor. And it was a legal matter. And he was an attorney, but not the right attorney. So he made the phone call, introduced us. And then when we got off the phone call, he said, look, there are going to be days when not a thing is going well, not one. And you're going to feel dreadful about the day. And then somebody calls up and says, hey, you know what? I'd really like to get your advice about this. You're one of the smartest people I know in this field. And if you've got a few minutes, I'd really appreciate some of your attention. And Ted said, you know, Kimi, sometimes the best thing that happens to you all day is to be able to give someone else a helpful hint, a suggestion. And there's something really nice about being able to do somebody that favor. So if you decide that on their behalf that they're too busy to do that, or you know, you're not important enough for them to do that, you've taken that opportunity to be generous away from them without their permission, and in a tiny moment of, frankly, arrogance. You don't get to say that. You don't get to decide for them. If you don't ask, the answer is no. But what if this would actually brighten their day? But you decided without their input.
Right. They could always say no, or can I do it tomorrow if it's really not the right time? And also, that's the worst that can happen. That is the absolute worst that can happen, is that they say no, right? Or that or that they ignore you. And of course, that's disappointing, but that's really the worst. And in fact, on the board of directors, on mentoring, and a couple things in the book, I talk a lot about paying it forward, because I think, first of all, it's the right thing for all of us to do if anyone's ever helped us. And second of all, it's lovely. It does. I mean, for me, at least, it makes me feel good. And then thirdly, I talk about one example where somebody asked me for help. And I think if you're asking people, sometimes if you have a warm lead, it helps. So this woman reached out and she said, I used to work at BCG. I heard you speak once. You don't know me, but I'm in this terrible spot in my career where you talk to me. And, I don't have time to do that for everybody who calls, right? As I'm sure you don't, but I try to respond to some. And I felt the way she talked about it, I felt emotionally concerned, and I talked to her, and you know what? It turned out that, and this just came up in casual conversation, I didn't ask her, that she knew somebody in Singapore that I've always wanted to chat with. And so later on, she introduced me.
That example.
Yeah, I talked about it in the book, I think, and I was like, wow, and it's not like I'm desperate to meet that person. So if I hadn't met him, that would have been okay too. But that's the other thing you don't know. Maybe there's something you have that they want that you find out later, and you're actually helping them. So don't it's like, don't undersell yourself and what you can deliver for other people. I agree.
I did tell Ted, 40 years later, I told him that I still remember that bit of advice. And he looked at me and he just roared. He said, did I say anything else wise? I said, oh, you don't think I'm going to blow your head up by, telling you everything that you've said over the past 40 years that I've listened to.
That's so funny.
But that was something that I thought was really great about the way that the two of you wrote this book. Although, I liked the earlier title, but I got to admit, Don't Quit Your Day Job is catchier. It's the thought that there's a knee-jerk reaction sometimes when people are unhappy, and all of a sudden it just seems like that's the right thing to do, and so they grab for it. And what I wanted to ask you was, how did you come up with the way that you formatted the suggestions and the mind shifts and the power shifts? Because it flows beautifully, and it's extremely practical in its application. It's none of this theoretical and then go figure out the practical steps you're going to do afterwards. How did you come up to that?
So, well, first of all, I'd like to respond to two things that you raised, Kimi, if you don't mind. So one is on the knee-jerk reaction. LinkedIn put something out early this year that said that the Wall Street Journal quoted that 4.5% of Americans who've quit their jobs in the Great Resignation have already boomeranged back to their old company. And Amy Cuddy, who's really famous for talking about like power position, body language, said that sometimes doing that is just, as you said, kind of a knee-jerk reaction of showing your power. I can go, I can leave you, which is great, but it's the wrong reason. Obviously for some of these people, it's the wrong reason. And so the book is about, how do you think about it? But sometimes it is the right time to go. So in terms of writing, basically, Wendy is the writer. So Wendy is what is often called a ghost writer. She's just not a ghost writer in this case, because why not put her name on the book? So normally when you work with a ghost writer, they don't have their name on the book. So it would just be me. But I thought it's good for her career too. So she's on the book. So
it's a collaboration.
It's a collaboration. Basically, my work experience, my ideas, although, there's some stories about her in there, because as we wrote, she was like, oh, this happened to me. Or I'd say, here's my idea. And she'd go, oh, wow, I wish I'd thought about that, 20 years ago. And so to be honest, she really helped me come up with the structure and the way that we segmented the book. So I had lots to say and lots of examples and lots of ideas, but despite growing up at the Boston Consulting Group, where a lot of time is spent structuring inductive, deductive logic and reasoning and creating decks for communicating with clients, I've never written before, and I really didn't know how to structure a book. So I have to give her all the credit for that.
Well, it's quite wonderful. It's it's a great primer, but it's also for, folks like me who I'm not gonna see so many decade marks again. It's also a way of rethinking what you're gonna do the next step, because for a lot of us, retirement looks different. It actually isn't retirement from working. It's just retiring from maybe that career and saying, all right, now I'm going to go do this one, sort of, like Lisa 3.0.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think what's practical about the book and what I like about it, although of course I'm an author, so I'm biased, is all the examples we put
You're
in. I think
supposed to
there's over 36 people in there, probably 60% women, 40% men, lots of different ethnicities, age range 21, I think, in the youngest example, to in their 60s. And so hopefully most people who read it can see themselves in at least one or two examples, or reflect that that might have been themselves at a different time. And so it's relatable. That's what I really wanted it to be, was relatable. And then all the action steps are summarized again at the end so that it can be used as a primer, as you say. And then for me personally, I've been reading The 100-Year Life. I don't know if you've read it, which is a book about long lives and long careers. I mean, part of it's very focused on how much do you have to save and how do you have to think about your jobs to have enough money if we're all going to live to 100, because it looks like people our age now might, and people younger than us might live longer. And so this 3-stage life of education, work till I'm 55 or 60, and then retire for 20 to 30 years isn't probably the right perspective, both in terms of financials, but also being happy. Like if you like me, being busy at work and doing things, and then you say, okay, I've worked for 40 years and now I'm going to do not much for 60 years, that's probably not going to be very satisfying. So that's kind of an interesting book to read. And there's lots more. I've seen a lot more coming out about that. And you've probably seen like Harvard and Stanford have these programs, fellows for people who are, a friend of mine's calling it elderberries. I don't know, but just,
I love it.
What do you do? Because like we have energy, and hopefully, I mean, this is you and me talking to each other. Some people may think we're useless, but hopefully we're not useless yet. And so how can we keep contributing and keep interested and relevant to the extent we want, but also maybe have some other things we've earned if we want them, like more flexibility.
And I think there's also a lot to be said for what you talked about, which was the role of curiosity. And I'm a firm believer that the day that I stop being curious about something, prepare the funeral urn.
That's a bit dire, but okay.
But no, I think even if it's just curiosity about little things, I was in the grocery store and I was looking at 2 different kinds of spices, and I realized I have no idea what either one tastes like. And so I bought them both. I'm home. To big things, like what about those professionals who you mentioned, and I agree, there's a value in the way that we communicate when we're in the same room, when we're literally not more than arm's length distance. I always love that phrase, because that means you're close enough to touch and far enough away to still be independent people. So I've always loved arm's length. But now there's a whole generation, if not more than one generation, of leaders and managers, and some managers will become leaders, who will never have the same visceral sense of that value that you and I do. And so that to me is a big leadership question. What is it that they're going to do to be able to build those kinds of connections and those kinds of bonds? So curiosity, I think, is going to be one of the saving graces for those of us who turn around one day and say, it's odd because I don't feel like I'm 80. And we're still busy and we're still vital and we're still doing our level best to contribute. And sometimes what we contribute is a little bit of silliness because some of my younger colleagues I see are, gosh, they're awfully earnest and they're awfully serious. I kind of worry about whether or not their curiosity and their sense of humor ever meet in the middle sometime.
I like that. That's a great Venn diagram, curiosity and sense of humor. I have to keep that in mind.
Thought about that. By the way, my social media gal, Tanita, thinks that taking the R out of remote is a great book title. And I promised her faithfully that I would let you know that. She's, oh, that would be such a great follow-up book. That would be a great book title. I said, well, I will make sure to mention that to Lisa.
I wrote a Forbes article about it. I'm not entirely sure I have enough to write a whole book about it, but please thank her for the advice and I'll keep thinking about it.
Oh,
I
she's
found it a
great.
very big effort to write a book, even with all the help from Wendy. I don't know if I've got a second book in me, but I should trademark it before somebody else does. But anyway,
Do.
it's good advice. So I don't think I will, but it's good advice. So I appreciate it.
Well, I thought it was cute because I believe very strongly what you talked about, which is relatability. And the other day, Tanita said something that I remember thinking, oh my goodness. She said, so I went to this restaurant and I tried that cheese dish, that saganaki thing. And I said,
Oh, I love Saganaki.
oh, is that wonderful? She said, how have I reached the age of 30 and not had this? And I thought, gosh, I have a jacket that's older than you. But it's great because there's a whole different energy reaching across there. And I think that's what you've done with this book is you've reached out a helping hand to people that you might never actually physically meet. And you've said, here, some of these things might be useful. Some of these things might save your professional life. And some of these things, well, they worked. If you're stuck for an answer, maybe they'll work for you too. And that, Aliza, I think that is probably one of the most generous ways of paying it forward that I've seen. So on behalf of all those people who wish they had this book a long time ago, thank you.
Thank you, Kimi. It's so nice to have had this time to chat with you. And I really do hope that by writing the book, I've helped, just a few people would be great payback. And if it's more than that, then even better. And all the author profits are going to Vital Voices, which is an organization that's designed to get women in leadership, more policy and political than business, globally, to try to make sure that there are policies that are generous towards or helpful towards women. So I am trying to give back a bit with the book. So thank you.
And I think that that's probably just a wonderful example of leading by example. So thank you again, Lisa, for your time and for that book, but mostly for the generosity of spirit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kimi.